Okay, let's dive into this. You've given us a really fascinating stack of information here, all about diet and inflammation.
Yeah, there's quite a bit. We've got studies on specific sugars, processed foods, and even a whole guide on, living an anti-inflammatory lifestyle.
Right. And our mission really for this deep dive is to pull out the key connections, the important insights from all this material.
Exactly. To help you understand how what you eat, maybe how you live day to day, can actually affect inflammation in your body.
And there are some surprising things in here, definitely some practical stuff too.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting is how all these different pieces, the sugar you eat, how well you sleep, they all seem to connect back to this one core process, inflammation.
Yeah, because we need to be clear. Inflammation isn't just like when you twist your ankle and it swells up, right?
Not at all. The sources are really talking about chronic, low-grade inflammation, the kind that sort of simmers below the surface.
And it's linked to some really serious health problems.
Yep. The source is connected to major chronic diseases, things like Alzheimer's, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, inflammatory bowel diseases like Crohn's and colitis, stroke, even some cancers. It's really widespread.
So if it's happening under the surface, kind of silently, how would you even know? How do doctors measure it?
Well, a really common way is a blood test. They look for something called C-reactive protein, often a high-sensitivity version, HSCRP.
HSCRP.
Okay. Think of it as a marker. Your liver makes more of it when there's inflammation somewhere in your body. Another one researchers use sometimes is ADA, adenosine deaminase, another signal of inflammation.
Got it. So these are like internal warning lights. And okay, medications exist, obviously, but these sources seem to really hammer home the lifestyle factor.
They really do. The research strongly suggests that your choices, especially around diet, but other habits too, can have a huge effect on managing these inflammation levels. It's a powerful lever you can pull.
So let's pull that lever. Let's start with maybe the most obvious suspect highlighted here, sugar. We all kind of know we should eat less, but how exactly does it fuel inflammation according to this research?
Well, one study in the sources is pretty striking. It looked at semi-professional football players,
Okay.
and it found a really strong link. The more simple sugars these players ate in their diet, the higher their inflammatory markers were, specifically that HSCRP we just mentioned and ADA.
Was it just any sugar, or were there specific types that stood out?
Good question. The strongest links were actually with fructose and glucose. Now, the players eating more simple sugar overall ate more of all kinds: glucose, galactose, fructose, sucrose, which is table sugar, lactose, maltose.
Right.
But yeah, it was higher fructose and glucose intake that lined up most clearly with higher HSCRP.
Huh. So it's these specific building blocks, fructose and glucose, that seem to be the main drivers there.
That's what the research points to, and the ways they might do it. Well, it gets a bit complex. They think it could increase gut permeability. The whole leaky gut idea, letting things cross into the bloodstream that shouldn't, triggering the immune system.
Right. Okay.
It might also encourage certain immune cells, neutrophils, to move into tissues, and it ramps up the production of pro-inflammatory cytokines.
Cytokines, those are the body's chemical messengers,
Yeah.
right? Like signaling molecules?
Exactly. They basically tell your immune system, hey, get fired up. And simple sugars seem to increase levels of specific ones like IL-6, IL-1, and TNF-alpha.
Wow.
The study even suggested it might contribute to muscle injury indirectly through insulin resistance, so another layer of potential inflammation.
That's quite a chain reaction just from sugar. Now, beyond those simple sugars, fructose and glucose, what other types of sugar do the sources warn about?
Well, they generally advise limiting processed, refined, or added sugars. So that's your white sugar, brown sugar, powdered sugar, corn syrup, usual suspects. Even fruit juices get flagged because while the sugar is natural, they lack the fiber you get from whole fruit, and that fiber helps slow down how quickly your body absorbs the sugar.
What about things often marketed as natural sweeteners, like honey or maple syrup? Are they okay?
The advice is still to limit them. The sources suggest, considering how processed they are too. But really the big takeaway across the board is too much sugar in pretty much any form consistently shows up as a problem linked to inflammation and other health issues.
Oh, okay. Makes sense. So shifting gears a bit from just sugar to, well, a much broader category, processed foods, especially ultra-processed foods, UPFs. That's a hot topic. Your sources get into that too.
They certainly do. There's a recent update included here from the UK's Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition, SACN, and it highlights a pretty consistent finding from lots of studies. Eating more UPFs is associated with a higher risk of, well, a whole range of bad health outcomes.
What kind of outcomes are we talking about? Is it similar to the stuff linked with inflammation?
Yeah, there's definitely a big overlap. Things like overweight and obesity,
Mm-hmm.
type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, certain cancers, chronic kidney disease,
Mm-hmm.
even inflammatory bowel disease, particularly Crohn's disease. Uh, Interestingly, the link wasn't as consistent for ulcerative colitis in all the studies they looked at, and even cavities, dental caries.
So why? Why do these UPFs seem tied to so many problems? Is it just the sugar again, or?
Well, the SACN report points out it's usually more than just one thing. UPFs, as a category, tend to have a less healthy nutritional profile overall compared to whole or minimally processed foods.
How so?
They're often higher in calories, higher in unhealthy fats like saturated fat, potentially trans fats, higher in total sugar, and higher in salt. So it's often the combination of these factors.
But is the science totally settled on UPFs? I feel like I hear debates about even defining them.
That's a really important point the sources raise. The science is definitely still evolving.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, there are limitations. There isn't one single definition of UPF that everyone agrees on, which makes comparing studies tricky.
Right.
Plus, a lot of the evidence is observational. It shows people who eat more UPFs tend to have more health problems. But that shows an association, not necessarily direct causation.
Meaning maybe people eating lots of UPFs also have other unhealthy habits.
Exactly. It's hard to isolate the UPF effect completely from the rest of the diet and lifestyle in those kinds of studies. It's a challenge.
Okay, but here's where I thought it got really interesting. The sources actually break down UPFs into subcategories. Does looking at it that way help? Like, are some processed foods maybe worse than others?
Yes, that adds some much-needed nuance. Looking at those subcategories, while findings did vary a bit between studies, two groups consistently seem to stand out with stronger links to increased health risks.
Which ones?
First, meat and animal products, specifically things like processed meats, sausages, deli meats, and also ready-to-eat meat, poultry, or seafood products.
Okay, processed meats.
And second, sweetened beverages. And interestingly, this included both the sugar-sweetened kind and those with artificial sweeteners.
Can you give an example from the sources? Like, what risks were linked to those categories?
Sure. For processed meats, studies linked higher consumption to increased risk of type 2 diabetes and high blood pressure. And those ready-to-eat meat, poultry, seafood products, they were associated with a higher risk of dying from several causes: overall mortality, cancer, cardiovascular disease, respiratory illness, and others.
Wow. Okay. And the drinks.
Yeah.
Artificially sweetened ones, too.
Yep. Both sugar-sweetened and artificially sweetened beverages were linked to higher risks of type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and also mortality overall, cardiovascular, and even neurodegenerative mortality in some studies.
So those two groups, processed meats and sweetened drinks, seem like particular areas of concern based on this. What about other types of UPFs? Breads, snacks, cereals? Were they all linked to problems?
No, and this is really key. For other categories, things like breads and cereals, savory snacks, dairy products, sauces, ready meals, the results were much more mixed. It varied a lot depending on the specific study and a health outcome they were looking at.
Mixed how? Like no effect?
Sometimes no clear effect, but sometimes some analyses actually found a reduced risk for certain outcomes with some types of UPS. For instance, a few studies associated some ultra-processed cereals or specific types of dark or whole grain bread with a lower risk of type 2 diabetes.
Really?
Yeah, though again, it wasn't consistent across all studies or all bread types. And one analysis mentioned found no consistent link between vegetarian meat alternatives, which are often ultra-processed, and negative health outcomes.
Huh. So it really hammers home that point, doesn't it? Just calling something UPF might be too simplistic. The type of food clearly matters.
Exactly. It suggests we need to look deeper than just the processing level and consider the actual nutritional content and the overall dietary pattern.
Okay. So beyond sugars and the whole UPF discussion, the sources also mentioned other dietary things linked to inflammation, specifically fats. What's the story there? It feels complicated.
Fats are definitely complex. The sources talk a lot about the balance between omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids.
Right. The omega.
The typical Western diet tends to be really high in omega-6s. You find them in lots of refined vegetable oils, like soybean, corn, sunflower oil.
And are they inherently bad, inflammatory?
Well, there's actually some debate there. One source suggests omega-6s themselves might not be automatically pro-inflammatory, maybe even beneficial depending on context. But what is clear across the board is the benefit of increasing your intake of anti-inflammatory omega-3s.
Okay. And where do we get those?
Fatty fish are great sources: salmon, mackerel, sardines. And some plant sources too, like flax seeds, chia seeds, walnuts. The focus is really on boosting those omega-3s.
What about trans fats? They still seem to have a terrible reputation. Is that justified based on this?
Absolutely justified. The sources are unanimous on trans fats,
Yeah.
usually listed as partially hydrogenated oils on labels. They are consistently shown to be really detrimental. They raise your bad LDL cholesterol, lower your good HDL cholesterol, directly contribute to inflammation, and significantly increase your risk for heart disease, stroke, and diabetes. Basically, zero benefit, lots of harm, often found in processed baked goods, fried foods, margarine.
Avoid those. Got it. What about saturated fats? Red meat, butter, full-fat dairy. There's so much conflicting info out there.
Yeah, the sources present a more nuanced picture for saturated fats. High intake, especially if your overall diet isn't great, is linked to higher cardiovascular risk and inflammation, particularly if someone is overweight.
But it's not totally black and white.
Not entirely. The key recommendation seems to be less about eliminating saturated fat completely and more about what you replace it with. Replacing saturated fats with beneficial unsaturated fats, especially monounsaturated like olive oil, and those polyunsaturated omega-3s is good. Replacing them with refined carbs or sugar, not so good. The overall diet context really matters.
That makes sense. Were there any other specific foods mentioned as potentially contributing to inflammation?
Yes, a couple of interesting ones. High amounts of commercially pre-roasted nuts were mentioned. Apparently, the high heat roasting process can cause some changes that might be inflammatory.
Oh, interesting.
And also processed foods labeled low-fat or fat-free. The issue there is that when manufacturers take the fat out, they often add back a load of sugar or refined carbs to make it taste good. So you might end up with something less healthy overall.
Sneaky. Okay, one more specific gluten. It gets blamed for inflammation a lot these days. What do the sources say?
Well, one source actually calls this out as a potential myth buster for the general population.
Oh.
It states there isn't really clear evidence that gluten itself is inherently inflammatory for most people. Now, of course, individual sensitivities exist. Celiac disease is real. Non-celiac gluten sensitivity might be linked to gut health issues for some. The source even touches on how modern wheat processing, or the sheer amount we eat, might play a role for sensitive individuals.
So not necessarily inflammatory for everyone.
Not based on the current broad evidence, according to that source. It even suggests that improving gut health might actually allow some people who thought they were sensitive to reintroduce gluten without problems. So it's complex and individual.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about things to potentially limit or be careful with, but it's not just about avoidance, is it? The sources also provide a guide to actively building an anti-inflammatory lifestyle.
Exactly, and that's crucial. Diet is a huge piece, maybe the biggest piece, but it's part of a larger picture.
So what does an anti-inflammatory eating pattern look like according to this? Is there one specific diet?
Not necessarily one size fits all, but the traditional Mediterranean diet comes up repeatedly as a really well-researched model.
The Mediterranean diet. Okay. What are its main features?
It's heavily plant-based, though not necessarily vegetarian or vegan. Loads of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes like beans and lentils. Healthy fats are key, especially extra virgin olive oil, nuts, and seeds.
What about protein?
Moderate amounts of fish, especially fatty fish, some white meat like poultry, eggs, and fermented dairy like yogurt or kefir. And then, importantly, it's low in sweets, red meat, and processed meats. The sources really emphasize that the benefit likely comes from the synergy of the whole pattern, not just picking out one or two superfoods.
Right, the whole package. So what specific things should you aim to increase if you want to eat more anti-inflammatorily?
Well, aim high on fruits and vegetables. One source suggests 4 to 5 cups a day, or even more if you can. Get those omega-3s in, maybe 2-3 servings of fatty fish a week, or use those plant sources like flax and walnuts daily.
Okay.
Prioritize monounsaturated fats like extra virgin olive oil. Use it for dressings, finishing dishes. Maybe use a different olive oil like pure or virgin for higher heat cooking to preserve some benefits.
Good tip.
Definitely boost your fiber intake. Aim for 30 grams a day or more, if possible, from things like beans, lentils, whole grains, fruits, vegetables. Choose lean proteins or more plant-based options. And really lean into anti-inflammatory herbs and spices, turmeric, ginger, garlic, cinnamon. Use them generously.
And sweets.
Limit them for sure. But dark chocolate, in moderation, gets a thumbs up.
Sounds pretty delicious, actually. But you said lifestyle is more than just food. What else is key?
Oh, absolutely. The sources are really clear that other lifestyle factors work hand in hand with diet. Regular physical activity is huge. Aiming for around 150 minutes of moderate aerobic exercise per week is a common recommendation.
Oh, okay.
Getting enough quality sleep is another big one. Consistently getting less than, say, 7 hours a night is linked to increased inflammation. Aiming for 7 hours is the general advice.
Sleep, exercise, what else?
Managing stress effectively. Chronic stress is a major driver of inflammation. So finding healthy ways to cope, whether it's mindfulness, meditation, yoga, spending time in nature, hobbies, whatever works for you.
Mm-hmm.
Maintaining a healthy weight is also important. Avoiding smoking is non-negotiable, really. And limiting alcohol intake. All these factors work together to help your body manage inflammation properly.
So putting it all together, this deep dive really shows a clear, strong link between our diet, especially the processed stuff, the sugars, certain fats, and this kind of hidden chronic inflammation.
Yeah, the connection is definitely highlighted across the sources. And that inflammation, in turn, is tied to so many long-term health problems.
Right. But the flip side, the encouraging part, is that it also lays out a positive path forward. Adopting an anti-inflammatory approach like that Mediterranean style focusing on whole foods.
Combined with those other healthy habits we just talked about, exercise, sleep, stress management.
It can be a really powerful tool to actually manage that inflammation and support long-term health.
It really empowers you with actionable steps based on the evidence presented.
But given those complexities we talked about, especially with UPFs, how the definition is tricky, how different categories seem to have different impacts, not all processed food is the same. It does leave you thinking, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. Where do you go from there?
Exactly. If just labeling something UPF isn't the whole story, how do we get better at looking past those simple labels? How do we develop a more maybe nuanced understanding that focuses on the actual food characteristics, the nutrients, the additives, the fiber, and the overall pattern of how we eat, to really figure out what's truly fueling inflammation versus what's fighting it?